Welcome and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion and conversation. I think is probably the best way to describe it. So yes, Sweden is on our map, on our horizons recently for all sorts of problematic incidences in relation to this whole discussion around the extent and limit of free speech and how we can operationalize that in a plural democracy with liberal sentiments, but also the idea that we want to protect certain norms, values within a banner of a kind of inclusive secularism, if you like. So I think these tensions are being played out in some of these Scandinavian countries, particularly Denmark and Sweden, where the question may be more framed as whether these actions are provocative for invoking the reaction which it seeks, which confirms or reaffirms the prejudice that somehow Muslims are reactionary and dangerous and problematic, and we need to do something about limiting their presence in certain ways. And I think the issue here about the question of whether this is provocative rather than an exercise in free speech is very valid here, because it's almost certain that when you carry out these kinds of incidences in deprived areas where there's a high degrees of exclusion and marginalization, people who have faced all sorts of downward pressures are vulnerable to this kind of exposure. And the reaction is not just a reaction to what is seen as something blasphemous or a desecration of their faith, but also because it's an accumulative response to being forced down in society and made to feel excluded and unwanted. And this occurs in the wider framing. So we have these localized incidences under the banner of free speech, which are to be framed under the wider problem of the generalization of Islamophobia. And Islamophobia isn't to be taken lightly in the sense that it has cultural, structural, ideological, historical dimensions to it, which remain deeply concentrated. And to the extent that they are so everyday, we hardly question its existence. So this hyper-normalization of Islamophobia is a real problem. And this Islamophobia provides license to certain far-right, radical right, extreme right wings, groups, to be able to express all sorts of anti-Muslim sentiment under the cover, in this case, of free speech or plural liberal democracy. So what's underpinning Islamophobia is obviously a wider war on terror sort of culture that permeates thinking domestically in terms of ideas around counterterrorism all the way to integration policy. And externally, we still have various endeavors going on in parts of the world that involve Western interests. And underpinning all of that is a wider set of problems around inequality in societies, traditionally in societies, for example, in the Nordic countries, which were seen as much more equal, with high welfare support for underprivileged groups, minority, majority, and the sense of cohesion that comes around with a balanced mixed economic and social policy approach. We see also the problem there of neoliberalism creeping into these Nordic countries where deregulation and the idea that free markets can solve solutions is leading to breakdown in traditional industrial, post-industrial norms, and a sense of being left behind and being frustrated, where globalization is seemingly benefiting other people elsewhere. And somehow these immigrants and minorities are the problem, and for our own localized problems, which are also about deindustrialization and exclusion in a wider framing. So there is an economic underpinning, there is a sociological change in terms of migration and the policies around where people are located. So we have to think about those aspects of government policy, and also a cultural phenomenon that is known as Islamophobia, which continues to grow and manifest itself in all sorts of dimensions, in all sorts of ways, without real check or balance. And today we're seeing these kinds of Qur'an burnings during the middle of Ramadan, for example, there to ignite literally the response that it seeks to evoke ultimately. So lots of factors that impact on these local experiences, but they're historical, they're structural, and they're ongoing, and they remain problematic. So there's just a few words I wanted to just perhaps highlight in terms of some of my thoughts around what I think is happening and might be going on. I'm very happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. Gabriel, over to you.
Yeah, just like Tahir said,
I mean, here it was experienced as, you know, adding insult to injury in many cases, because one of the first things that I did when these things occurred was that I went out into to my own informants, and I asked them, you know, on the ground, what's going on. And many of them said that, you know, that to them, you know, the police coming out and protecting him with these things, it feels like a provocation from the state, which it isn't really. I mean, this is about, you know, the state protecting his freedom of speech and so on. But, you know, given the fact that many don't really understand how society works, unfortunately, which is the result of, you know, segregation and these things. Many experiences these large, you know, police gatherings, you know, that the state is behind him, and, you know, they are making a manifestation against the Muslims, and obviously it's not correct, but it was interpreted that way, which is false, of course. And also many felt that, you know, the police are coming out for him, but, you know, in these areas, a lot of crime, there are a lot of, you know, all of these various problems, but, you know, the police aren't focusing so much on that. But when he comes and he wants to provoke, then, you know, they show up with, you know, hundreds of police officers. So that was this strange interpretation that, you know, occurred. And other than that, yeah, I mean, you have to put it in a historical context that, you know, when they did a census in 1930, you know, how many, in religious terms, how many, you know, non-Christians were in Sweden. You know, Muslims were 32 individuals from a population of 6 million. So, you know, and so the demographic changes have been very dramatic, because now it's something like 700,000, I think. So there's a large demographic change that has occurred during the 20th century and the 21st century. And obviously, there have been some issues to accommodate that. And the first Muslims who came here, the first communities that were established, they were working class mainly. And they were seen as, obviously, it's like in the Netherlands, they were guest workers. But then they decided to stay. And then they were housed in these areas that at the time they were new. They were built for workers initially, but the Swedish workers, they moved away as their economy raised. And, you know, these type of enclaves were formed. And now we have second generation, third generation still living in there. And I mean, the socio-economic level is pretty, you know, it's lower than in the rest of society. And, you know, there are much more problems with, you know, the education, the schooling there are poorer. And, you know, the density is higher, and the cramping in what's called cramped living is much higher. And all of these factors that, you know, within sociology, you know, it's going to just be a problem. And yeah, so fast forwarding a bit. So when these things occurred, it was like, you know, adding insult to injury, given all of this discrimination experience, you know, living poorly and so on, because obviously it's the experience that counts, you know, even if, you know, they say that, you know, oh, maybe it isn't so bad, you know, so on, but, you know, it isn't experienced this way in these neighborhoods. Their own experience is that they are victims of, you know, these various things, true or not, it doesn't really matter. So for many, it was like, you know, the straw that broke the camel's back, him turning up and desecrating the holy Qur'an. So that's my introduction, I would say, to the issue.
Thank you. And I think, sorry if I'm jumping in.
No,
but no,
thank
you. I think it's a good sort of overview of what we've seen in terms of outcomes. Well, if we try to explain them away as prima facie on what we think we see when we talk about high crime rates, deprivation, segregation. I mean, segregation is a highly loaded term. I mean, there are plenty of discourses, sadly, that suggest that this kind of segregation is self-styled, or yeah, it's a deliberate attempt to try and live separate lives. Well, we know that that's not reality. More often than not, these failed policy, the integration policies of governments in the post-war period, as mentioned, from guest worker migration systems onwards, have prevented social mobility. Ongoing patterns of exclusion and disadvantage have meant that there have been lower impacts in terms of labour market success, despite education, qualifications, so on. So you have areas in cities and towns with lower resources, limited opportunities, downward pressures, including the fact that some of the educational infrastructure in these areas are poor to begin with, and opportunities are elsewhere. And particularly if we think about the much more divided societies that are becoming more the norm in the Nordic context, but elsewhere in Western Europe, where any ideas of welfare support for the underprivileged, the minorities, the poor, the infirm, etc., are part of the post-war model, rapidly disappearing. And this is where we get these grievances. And it's the grievances among the poor, the left behind, who are Muslim minorities, but also the poor, the left behind, who are white majorities, for lack of a better term, people whose traditional opportunities have been taken away because of globalization and localization. What were automatic jobs in factories or plants 30, 40 years ago just don't exist. It's competing in the service sector economy, because that's where all the jobs are in Western Europe, predominantly manufacturing, and agriculture is nothing in terms of GDP. So the service sector economy, it's global, and it's also not a gendered role anymore, if it ever was, of course. And so men are having to compete much more globally with women and with other men, if you like, from elsewhere for local jobs. So that resentment, that sense of being left behind, is easily exploited by various political movements, including fringe movements like this particular party, an individual. And we have here as well people like Wilders in the Netherlands. We have had the origins of UKIP go back to the mid-2000s, which was a response to the idea that the problem was the European Union itself, but underpinning it was just kind of hostility to immigration and minority discourses. So we have this normalization of far-right politics generally across our landscape, which is also something to think about, how so that it makes it easier. So it makes people feel more emboldened to be able to carry out these kinds of actions under the banner of free speech. And going back to the point there about the state protecting this individual and not protecting them, it's a real issue. We've talked about how minorities don't get the same kind of policing services, are more likely to be prosecuted for similar offences, more likely to have longer sentences, more likely to have this profile attached to them, stop and searches and so on. So there are these discriminatory practices across all aspects of society that come together. Policing is one element of them. It's related to education. It's related to housing policy, social housing policy. It's related to a discrimination in the labour market, which can be measured, and we can see it time and time again. So there are these systematic patterns that underpin the reality of the frustration that blows over at times like this. But what are we doing about these situations around provocative actions at one level, but what are we doing about a much wider historical set of problems in terms of poor policy making and a lack of opportunity for far too many people?
I mean, these are historic problems because, I mean, one of the reasons, because we have an issue with that, due to segregation, many who have grown up like this, they have a difficulty in interpreting social cultural norms, and the social mores of the country. So some of the things, I mean, this is not just about the fires, about, more general things as well. I mean, many things that, maybe aren't really discriminatory, or maybe they aren't exactly Islamophobic, they're interpreted that way because you don't know how to interpret the social codes, or, because if we go back to, the journey from a homogeneous culture and country to, multicultural country, there are some things that, the host society or host population, they have some skepticism towards this very sort of foreign, foreign faith, foreign cultures and so on. And some didn't know how to interpret this. That they feel that they're suspicious towards them or something, it's interpreted as they are Islamophobic, and it isn't really correct.
Or it's experienced, as you say, because it's not just about people's sense of something going wrong. It's obvious to see, and if these patterns keep repeating themselves, it's not just an accident that happens every time. There's something deeper, more systematic going on underneath. And you're right, it's not like as if Western Europe has seen much more migration, where there's also a colonial link somehow gets it better. Far from it. And of course, it's absolutely right. Not every minority is affected by this Islamophobic reality. People do cut through it and find a way. And it's also true that 90% of majority society is not Islamophobic or racist per se. It's just the ones who make the most noise get all the attention. And that's on all sides, of course. And this is it. We have to understand that this is a much bigger picture, and we are looking sort of smaller elements, but it's the smaller elements that clash and become the focus. Then we think it's much more generalized. And politicians, the political classes, are also to be held accountable here, because they can exploit these breaks in society for their own end. And this is where we get populism and authoritarianism.
I've seen quite a lot of that over here because, you know, all this political discourse, especially it rose during the years of ISIS, of course, and then it, you know, it peaked, you know, and even, you know, even practices that, you know, are just normative Sunni Muslim practices, piety, even that were described as extremists by, you know, politicians and so on. So it created, I mean, that's the issue. It created a siege mentality among many Muslims that, you know, the establishment is out to get us and the populace is out to get us and these things. And obviously it isn't true exactly, but it was interpreted that way because also when you live in segregation, you know, so one of the channels that you have to interpret the society is the media. And if the media is full with politicians saying, you know, we want to ban your religious practices, want to ban your, you know, so on and so forth, it's seen as a reflection of what society thinks of you. So you live with this siege mentality, and you know, even small things can trigger you. Is this wear and tear mechanism sets in? Even small things can trigger.
Yeah, I agree, and it's like the accumulation of so many small things can blow up and manifest themselves, and if it's ongoing and there's no seeming way out, and then any kind of complaint or any kind of attempt to redress it is pushed back, and you feel there's a constant inequity in all aspects of society, and it's genuinely difficult to try and break these down. Then it causes frustration. I mean, some of these issues and tensions have been in play for Europe, Western Europe, for 20 plus years and perhaps longer even. And it is in those circumstances that I've argued in my work, and we're trying to look at in terms of the project that is looking at social exclusion and radicalization, is that's where we get the frustrations and grievances that can potentially boil over, because the vast majority of the people who are facing those circumstances just try and get on and keep on with their lives as best as possible and stay off the radar of any negativity. But the one or two, a few, with other vulnerabilities, it's psychological often. And this is also the case with our far-right groups. I mean, the vast majority of people per se in society who feel exclusion are white majority groups. The vast majority of people who fall behind in education tend to be white young men. And you know, these are structural foundational issues. But the number who enter into extremism are very few. But they need something else that goes on when we think about extremism. And there are these ideological push factors and the sense of belonging, the sense of community that people find online and offline. So in that respect, but going back to these kind of incidences around what this chap is doing, Raslan and so on, it's clearly it's working, I guess, from his point of view.
yeah, it's working quite well.
Sorry, just to ask you, I was going to say, as Tahir was saying, I mean, there are white populations, for want of a better term, there are as marginalized, if you like, by globalization, this kind of thing, that lose out in the same way. Yeah. There is no other group that reacts to religious provocations in this way. And even when we say provocations, I mean, after all, who is free speech for? It's for provocateurs. You don't need free speech for people who say things that are popular or that are accepted widely. Free speech is to protect troublesome people. But what I'm saying is that there is, I think, an element which maybe you can speak to, but if it was not for the fact that they could rely on this reaction happening, and as you say, the far right capitalize on it because it is reliable. They know that this will happen every time they do it. But there's an element of why is it on the other side? Like the minute they couldn't rely on it. Go for it.
Sorry, there's a presumption in the question that somehow they are reacting or they are channeling something within that's only a question of when as to when it emerges. And this is part of the problem when we think that, you know, only Muslims react in this way to you know, blasphemy, as it were, or particular quote unquote provocative actions, because there's something about them being Muslims. And I think this is where the problem, you know, is also borderline Islamophobic in terms of putting it together like that. I.e., we have to then try and claw it back a little bit and explore the range of accumulative grievances that go on here. It's not just, you know, since the last few years. For many people, it's since birth. Boarding, social housing, local schooling problematic, hostile policing, hostile media, and of course there's resource issues and a lack of capacity within communities that also need to be taken into account in some thinking around radicalization. The one solution is more Islam, not less. If people had education in Islamic values norms, if they understood the kind of the wider contribution of Islamic civilization to all aspects of the world today, it would make a very different outlook. And of course, that's not always there. I mean, I've just returned from a slightly separate subject from the Gulf around looking at radicalization there. And historically, there have been internal issues, and it's to do with education and awareness and critical thinking and critical analysis. And once you start to bring that into play, it stops people from a very early age thinking in very regressive black and white terms.
Yeah.
But this idea of kind of, you know, let's go and get violent against the police, and because it's somehow an Islamic response, isn't exactly what's happening. It's the only real sort of language they can work through. It's the only real vehicle that they have, which is to get upset and get angry and, you know, burn cars and react to the wider problems of institutional exclusion. It's an accumulation of so many factors projected through their own perhaps misunderstanding of religion. But then, you know, it's born out of weakness, not strength. It's a lack of opportunity.
Sorry to interrupt it.
Yeah.
But you would draw a clearer line between kind of social and material marginalization and deprivation, rather than any religious doctrine for why the reaction comes to the Quran burning, rather than, because I mean, presumably these problems are largely ongoing, and there are other provocations. There are surely racist attacks and things that don't spark this wide-scale reaction.
But it's the wear and tear effect. Many small things add up.
Right.
It's ongoing. It's unidirectional. It's systematic, and it continues. So there's a point. There's a tipping point. I mean, you can, you know, turn the cheek on your first slap, but what happens next time around? I mean, you can't go on. It's the same thing what happens with Israel and Palestine. It's like there's only so much, and there's reaction, and then it creates even more of an aggression. So there are some inequities here. Muslims don't have recourse to the law in the same way you would expect everybody else, because there are some discriminatory practices within the legal system. Political processes, where is their voice? How is it being expressed? How can they fight for their freedoms and rights in a way that is fair and a system that's open and accepting? So we need a much wider economic shift, and also a language around the political classes and how they speak to these problems, rather than sort of almost exaggerating them further. And we've seen this in France. It's become political football. Recent elections, it was all about that. And yeah, so the Muslims are a kickbag for so many European political entities, and they are soft targets because they themselves lack some internal capacity and organization. Not always, but there is an element of that.
Yeah, we have this discriminatory equilibrium right now going on, both in France and also here. You know, the Muslims do something that's seen as provocative, and then, you know, society responds, and then, you know, the Muslim communities respond again, and it's very, you know, I mean, what's provocative, what's not, because in a very, very secular society and country, you know, merely being openly religious is seen as provocative, you know, or, you know, doing religious rituals or something openly, it's interpreted as, you know, strange, and, you know, and again, the communities might not be able to interpret the response to that they don't really understand, because they like, you know, oh, these countries, you know, it's a democracy, we have freedom here, you know, why are they being provoked by us? Unfortunately,
we have to, sorry, also to interrupt, to be careful about how we generalize this to communities. We're talking about a handful of individuals that take all the attention, and you know, it's a criminal element in the sense of, you know, angry young men who, I mean, we see what happens in football matches. We see what happens everywhere where there is frustration and the coming together. So I don't think it's, you know, generalizable to communities. I think it's those few young individuals who are a kind of boiling point. And it's a kind of expressed masculinity. It's also just cumulative frustrations. But I think, without a doubt, behind the scenes, within households, within religious circles, there is always an attempt to try and normalize issues, to try and negate the need for violence, to try to adopt a liberal, tolerant approach, where the teachings of Islam are extensive enough to include all of that. But it's the few. We have to be careful, and it's the few on the other side. This chap, Ruslan, it is not indicative of Danish or Swedish society, far from it. It's just the very, very few who make all the noise, and we have to be very careful. We have to break it down and have a lot of critical thinking on all sides.
Yeah, I mean, of course, all the moderate imams here, they just say, you know, don't go out, just close your windows and doors, and, you know, shut your curtains, and, you know, just ignore him, because obviously, if you ignore him, it's going to stop eventually, and there's no point in continuing. But yeah, unfortunately, you know, not everyone heeds to these calls, and they go out and they do various things. As for some, as I understood it, you know, when I talked to people after it happened, and it's still ongoing, by the way. There's another burning taking place tomorrow. I mean, so some of them are just going out for the entertainment, really, you know, throwing things at the police.
Exactly. It's like those people, like a good percentage of people who went to Islamic State from Europe went for the thrill, for the adventure.
Exactly.
There's a question here maybe you might be able to speak to, which is about whether this is kicked off since 2016. Perhaps, Gabriel, you might have a...
Yeah, I mean, we have this, like I mentioned, this discrimination equilibrium, you know, both sides are fueling each other, because obviously we have some behaviors that are interpreted as provocative, and, you know, it's a response, and it goes like this. And the issue is that a lot of these points that used to be sort of far rightish, they have become more mainstream. And gone into liberal discourse, and also some of the socialist discourse even, and not just, you know, related to Muslim communities, but also, you know, we have many smaller towns that used to be industries, you know, where the industries were shut down and moved to, you know, Asia and so forth, and, you know, many there, they don't really know what to do.
Yes.
So in these towns there have been a growth of far right groups, and also Nazi groups even.
That's pretty consistent. I think the tilt towards radical right, far right, extreme right, hard right, localized and more globalized politics is in response to the changing base of the economic cycle. And this idea of left behind is much more generalizable for global north societies, including Australia as well in this. In that the sense that, you know, our futures have been taken away from us. It's the immigrants or the minorities or this multiculturalism nonsense, and the politicians are lapping that up. And I mean, this is what Brexit was about, which was actually about the European Union being somehow all powerful and all dictatorial, when in fact the Brits had some of the biggest roles in shaping EU law over the years. It is a nonsense. Sorry, I know I'm showing my card on Brexit, but it's about that frustration that was exploited elsewhere. The question now I think we should perhaps think about is what to do about it. I think we've got a pretty consistent understanding of the problems. So what do we do to try and fix it? I mean, we need billions to turn the fortunes of small towns that relied on industry and make them successful or prosperous again and attractive to others, where people feel, you know, they have a sense of contribution to life and so on. That's not happening. I mean, in the UK, there are massive north-south discrepancies. The wealth is concentrated, and it gets more and more concentrated, and the people in the north, and then they get told a different story, but nothing happens by change in terms of investment or opportunities or jobs or relocation of major institutions in the north. It's just, and this has been 40 years in the making. I've been writing and watching this since the early 1980s in terms of the regional and north-south divide. What do we do about this? Because the more we understand this is pretty, you could have said this 10 years ago, maybe to less of a scale, but nothing really happens. What needs to happen, and how will it happen if there are no real changes to things like opportunities and the ability to people to get an education that allows them to get the job that's appropriate to that, and to make a contribution to life, and be happy citizens who pay taxes and take part in politics and all the rest of it that we envisage in this kind of lovely plural democracies. We're tilting away from that. What do we do? Gabriel, tell us, how do we fix all of these problems? Yeah,
well, the bottom line is as long as the push factors are constant, you know, any pull factor coming along will be attractive.
Yeah.
Whether it's you know, Daesh, ISIS rising again, or if it's, you know, something else, you know, coming along. So, I mean, it would take a lot of political will and some political shifts to you know, accommodate such changes. I mean, what I see here is, you know, high level of segregation problem. You know, we have unfortunately, very unfortunately, too high a level of actually discriminatory practices as well. And it's also this type of you know, it's called taste-based discrimination, you know, where you discriminate based on, you know, prejudice rather than correct, you know, visual characteristics. And there's and in the communities, there are some problems with, you know, navigating society, which is, I wouldn't say it's a minority that has this problem. I would say it's quite common, actually. You know, how to navigate society, how to navigate the social codes, how to understand, you know, where you're living. Because there is something to be wished for there. And, you know, making the schools better in these areas also. And more entrepreneurship as well. Because
yeah, and you probably need more role models as well. Sorry.
I was going to say there's been a lot of talk about kind of globalization as a problem in this, that it's destroyed a lot of industrial centers in the West and sent them further east, this kind of thing. So is it possible to have the kind of corrective social and economic work you would want without globalization, or rather while globalization remains? And if globalization goes, presumably what you would have is more national governments and more nationalist governments.
We have more
national governments. They would have to be in control of their own territory, run their own policy. Things like the European Union are presumably more of a hindrance to this project because they're neoliberal in outlook. How do you square the circle? Because obviously I can tell you would favor that kind of multinationalism.
No, I think you're right. I mean, there's a risk of sort of resting on idealism here, that if we all just got it all sorted out with lots of money thrown at it, it would be fine. I mean, I think the EU shouldn't be seen as a bogey here. I think the EU have looked out for areas that have fallen behind, including things like the agricultural sector. We have leave voting areas that benefit extensively from EU money to keep up local industries, agricultural sectors. And again, the sort of the irony of a lot of that. I mean, it doesn't require, I mean, it requires, for one, a political will, where you know, 20 plus years ago, multiculturalism was seen as a success. It was seen as a good thing, that we could live with diversity, and that diversity enhances our collective lived experience. Everything from the kind of the commodification of ethnicity, you know, restaurants and festivals, arts and literature, to all the way to the idea of that diversity within workplaces adds to happier workers, to more productive bottom lines as well. I mean, I think some studies that confirms this. So diversity, if sold, can be experienced very positively, but the political will isn't there, and it's too easy to capitalize on the opposite, which is to talk about the essence of the self and protecting borders, protecting, you know, British jobs for British workers. Even Gordon Brown made a speech in that vein in 2008, which was the beginning of some of the problems we see today. And in many ways, it's a lack of a response to globalization at a coordinated, localized level that's added further to the tensions and the concerns here overall. It's not going to happen because, again, we see the similar problems of extremism in, say, the Middle East region around unemployment, deprivation, and urbanization, and real major structural problems. If a river stops flowing, then local tribes will go to war. Really basic things, and if anything, Iraq is going to be facing climate change implications more than extremism issues going forward after its re-stabilization. But what to do? I mean, I think it starts with the political will. There needs to be a political communication from the very top that talks about celebrating and diversity and inclusion, and not seeing it as a threat. You see, the problem with a lot today is that somehow migration and immigration is creating a dilution of the self. And these are kind of issues that go back much further in history, around the idea of racial purity, that somehow we would be weaker if we were to incorporate others. And there's a real lack of confidence around nation building in this context, in globalization. Rather than embracing the global and applying it at the local and global level, we've retreated into a very special sense of ourselves. You know, the idea of being English is still very tied to Anglo-Saxon heritage. The idea of kind of Nordic blood and purity, racial purity, and so on. These are also things that have found more of an acceptance in my majority society. I mean, Donald Trump is a famous eugenicist. He very much believed and advocated in certain selective breeding practices. And that again, you know, he became president on some of his racist ideas. So racism is there as well. Racism never went away, and Islamophobia is a manifestation of racism too. And some of these practices around exclusion cannot be divorced from wider structural issues around racism. So we have to start from the very top. We have to think about what goes on in education, some of the curriculum. What do people learn? How do they think about the other? What's in history syllabuses, all the way to what kinds of research get done. And of course, I know in Sweden and I know in other Nordic countries, there are institutions working on extremism and Islamophobia and exclusion that are very sensitive and appreciative of this. And we mustn't generalize this to a problem of Swedes or Nordic countries, or it's the problem of Muslims in those countries. It's really the very few, and we have to kind of break it down to what is ultimately useful there. In terms of local solutions, we have projects. You see, this is another problem. Okay, so we can't do anything about the bigger things around regional development, say. So let's do something locally with local communities in particular settings. Many years ago, it was possible to get women's development projects or youth empowerment projects or media engagement projects for Muslim communities or other Asian, ethnic, African, Caribbean minority communities. But today, in order to get that kind of funding, you have to kind of tick the CVE box that somehow empowering communities is a way to prevent extremism down the line, which is again a huge problem, partly because there's no other way of getting funding for community development, and also that you associate the community's needs with extremism reduction. And so it just reinforces that logic that somehow there's a time bomb ticking away and it's only a question of when, and let's just bury our heads in the meantime and hope for the best.
To Gabriel? Do you have a way of squaring the circle with globalization?
Well, politics isn't exactly my field. I'm much more, closer to the grassroots. So these larger political questions, I wouldn't really know or have a comment on exactly. But I can just put some historical perspective on it. I mean, given the homogeneous nature of these countries that they used to, there weren't really any minorities here. I mean, for example, the Jewish community were only allowed to settle in 1773, I think. And, the Church of Sweden used to be very, very strong and very imposing also, and would control most of these social institutions. And that also Sweden didn't actually have religious freedom until 1953. Until 1953, it was illegal for Catholics to become doctors, nurses, teachers, some other things as well. I think Jews as well were excluded. So you had this very strong sense of homogeneity here. And obviously the shift that, having 32 Muslims in 1930 to having, 700,000 now, it puts some strain to these, things really. And just, because when I talk to people, when I have talked to people during these 6 years, a lot of things that I hear is that, they don't see so much that they can identify with here from people from the Muslim community, because it's very strange because, the country is very secular, very liberal, and so forth. And, religious sensitivities is seen as antiquated, that they are not relevant. And many Muslims have religious sensitivities. It's just a fact. So there is this type of, you can't really navigate. You don't really know what's going on around you. And unfortunately, it's more common that it should be.
I agree.
Sure. Yeah. We have a question in the chat, actually, Gabriel, about this, which is there any kind of non-sectarian force that can bring these grievances to the public, can be their representative to political institutions, social institutions, the media, this kind of thing? Are such things in existence in Sweden, or are we some way off from them?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there exists such a force right now. I don't think so.
It's just basically the loudest voices.
It's very polarized right now.
Right.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the kinds of things we might have seen here in the past. Obviously, because immigration is relatively new to Nordic countries. It's on the back of the sort of Islamic State problems and migration and refugees, and having to suddenly come to terms with all of that while all these bombs are going off elsewhere. It's still very, and it's taken time here. And if we think about the Moroccans in the Netherlands who came in the 60s, it was the less educated folks from the smaller towns and areas who were preferred because. Well, actually, immigration policy was a bit racist here, in that respect, that if you could speak French, and if you were Moroccan, you were denied a visa. But if you didn't speak French, you were given one to work as an industrial worker, because there was a fear that you might organize yourself. There's always the idea that migrants, minorities would be here for work and then go away. And that was the same in the 50s and 60s in Britain, and then 60s and 70s in France, Germany, and so on. So it's too late now. Approximately 10% of societies across Western Europe and Northwestern Europe are about 10% Muslim, and sometimes the highest minorities. But then in the case of Denmark, in the case of the Netherlands and France, you've got third, fourth generations. And some people are still stuck in those kind of geographically deprived areas. And then you're right, you get a certain mindset that makes you feel that the whole world's against you and you're living a parallel life. And that's, again, an accumulation of external issues. But how you deal with it internally are about resources and opportunities and getting that chance. And people who do get through it, but people who don't, get ill, get frustrated. A lot of these folks end up in extremism, having mental health problems. They've always had mental health problems. We've only really now thought about it when we see the far right and think, aha, these people have got mental health problems. Yes, for sure. Even back to this chap who does the Qur'an burnings, he's had some problems as well. Nobody's without these issues. There are some traumas that people carry. So we can do some of these things. We can do local projects, we can do local initiatives, build confidence, trust, and engagement, even just church festivals or celebration days in schools, just to make people come out of their shells and realize, we're still human beings. But as Gabriel says, in a very polarized, very separated setup at the moment, there is nothing that connects or bridges those spaces. And sometimes when you do, and I know that in Europe, Muslim commentators, activists, if you speak too much or say too many things, then you get attacked and you're seen as part of the problem, and then back down the slippery slope and up and try again for all of us. So it'll probably be slow gains by the sounds of it in Sweden over the next few years. It probably needs to take a massive political change in direction from the top down, and I think some. Yeah, I mean, I also fear it's probably going to take a lot more. We're coming out of COVID. We've retreated in ourselves as humanity, and it's going to take time to come out. We've got huge economic issues, notwithstanding all the problems with inflation everywhere and interest rates and growth issues and wage demands and so on. So a lot of precariousness is going to remain from that. And in that fragility, we get all of these extremism pop out. People looking for attention, people looking for a sense of belonging, people looking to be heard in a crowded space.
Yeah, I mean, the discrimination equilibrium, it creates, forces on both sides. On the Muslim side, unfortunately, you have, the Takfiri preachers.
They exploit it.
Yeah, the Ikhwani people and so on, so forth, that, they're agitating because they see the response from society to their practices or beliefs or something. And they take, they put this in this narrative where they say, yes, the West, they are really our enemies. They are out to get us. And
yes. Yeah. But again, just to add there, things like mainstream groups like Ikhwani or Jamaat Islami type groups that we know that historically have had implications elsewhere, Middle East, South Asia, they're not as active in the radicalization process. They might hold these views, but Hizb ut-Tahrir has never had one of their members involved in any terrorist action, and yet they're getting banned everywhere because of the socially conservative responses. And even, as you said earlier, being socially conservative is seen as the route to extremism per se. But it's interesting, research done on kind of jihadi Salafis in France tell us that it's not the Salafi groups that are saying, they're breeding this jihadism. They're actually pushing the jihadi extremists out and said, you give us a bad name. We don't want extremism. We don't want violence. But so these very extreme people, they're not out of the mainstream at all. They're out of all elements of any mainstream perspective, minority and majority, and that's why they don't fit anywhere.
Yeah, they are marginal.
Yeah, very, very indeed. Even within the extremes within. So this is what I was saying earlier, and I think in Germany they thought about this as well, where Islam could be a route. A quick question, we talk about Europe and Moroccans and Turks, which are the biggest numbers, but the Turkish groups are never implicated in extremism. Why is that? Well, they do have a foreign ministry that looks after the Muslims in diaspora. They regulate Imam training and preaching. They have these associational life kinds of groups in the diaspora, and the football teams, the football leagues full of Turks, but not for the Moroccans in the Netherlands. What's going on? Don't Moroccans like football? Clearly not. But there are some organizational capacity issues that the Turks have that have helped ideas of integration and belonging and a collective sense of Turkish nationhood as well, which is a bit more fragmented, much more fragmented among the Moroccans, even in terms of religious organization, even in Morocco. So you see the fragilities are very nuanced, even within communities that arrive at the same time, live in the same areas, have the same kind of socioeconomic profile. But one group entirely implicated in the Dutch context, and the other group completely out of that extremism bag.
I think there's just to add to the complications though as well, that as you know, the operations of Diyanet, the Turkish religious ministry, have encountered significant pushback, particularly in the Netherlands and in Germany, for two basic reasons. One of which is states do not like foreign states.
Sure.
Gaining the loyalty of part of their population. I should say that a part of what Diyanet does is not just religious teaching, but it's Turkish nationalism, and they teach the population. But the other, even more serious element of this is the espionage, because the Turks use the Diyanet to keep an eye on the Hizmet, the Gulenists, on the PKK, and on more generally on the Turkish emigre population. So I don't really know.
But I think well, I mean, I think there's some questions there, and I know that politically, the Turkish political parties have tried to navigate their supporters across the diaspora, and they've been resistant to that. And I know that the Dutch stopped minister campaigning, and it created a bit of tension here, going back, I think, 2016. But the Diyanet is strictly religious. I mean, there might be accusations. I'm not sure about any evidence to support it, but certainly there is that feeling that these foreign powers are somehow infiltrating. But if it's helping to prevent extremism and radicalization as a start, certainly that's a win. But at the same time, I understand that the Moroccans are also trying to do something similar. And of course, anything the Moroccans do is important because of the numbers of second, third generation Moroccans implicated here. And it's also seen as a form of surveillance and securitization from within that's become necessary for the Moroccans. It's not straightforward.
I didn't mean to deny all the work that Diyanet does. I've been interested in it myself as a model because there's a clear difference with it, because the Turks, I don't know if you remember this case in 2002, but so immediately after 9/11, and obviously at that time everyone was kind of remarking, well, that there are no Turks involved in all this. Why is that? And then there were some Turks involved, but they were educated in Germany, in German seminaries, and you can just see this clear difference. But and what I'm saying is that just within the context of nation states, there is this problem that states are very touchy about foreign states on their territory, and particularly the espionage aspect has become a problem, not least because the Turks were slightly clumsy about it themselves, especially in Germany, because they went to the Germans and said, this person have done X, Y, Z. And they said, well, how do you know that? And they said, well, we have people who are watching them. And they said, who is watching them? And they gave the names, and Germany PNG'd them all. So this has been, they were quite clumsy about how they've done it. But what I'm saying is basically, how do we square the circle that there are these aspects that are going to have resistance, but it may be the model to go forward with.
It's something that's balanced and it's not sort of it's done independently of each other, and it makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot of skepticism across the European Union, and Turks, at one point, Turkey was going to join, and there was a lot of fuss in the mid-2000s, and obviously it's been going to join for a long time, but it had more of a chance. A very well-educated, technological savvy, youthful population at the doors of Europe would solve many of its migration, labor market needs, issues. But this Turkophobia and Turko-skepticism and Islamophobia wrapped into that. And now there's no chance. And I remember in the last 2-3 years when I was there, the Turks couldn't give a hoot about the European Union. We don't need it. We want to do our own thing. But then there were other problems that Turkey was having at the time as well, kind of embroiled in the whole, what was happening in Syria and what was happening with people penetrating its borders to go into Iraq, Syria. Interesting things, but for sure, Turkish communities on the whole have a very different experience compared with other Muslim minorities arrived at the same time. Not all great, but they do also have these issues of social housing and exclusion, but they have a certain, when I say Turkish nationalism, it's almost every Turkish organization to have certain nationalism involved in it. It's a very proud nation, very proud people, very proud heritage, and that comes through whether you're secular, leftist, Kurdish, well, less Kurdish, but leftist, secular, Islamist, or otherwise. Yeah, interesting stuff. Final thoughts?
Over to Gabriel.
Well, I mean, to the macro problem, I don't really see any solutions that's actually, viable at the moment, because we have this polarization. I don't know how it's going to go away, because right now it's just going downwards in a vicious circle, really. Both sides are just angry at each other and, provoking each other. And, I don't know where it's going to end, really, because we're also having national elections this year, general elections. And we might get a government, with a far-right party involved. And what they are going to do, it's quite scary, because that's set to radicalize even more. So hard to say. And also the communities have some responsibility too. I don't want to bang on the communities too much, but they have a responsibility to learn to navigate society and correctly interpret social cultural phenomenon and codes, and what they're really about, and that everything isn't Islamophobia, everything isn't discrimination. There are just some, given the vast cultural differences, there are some friction that's going to happen, and that friction isn't necessarily negative. And that friction isn't really, it shouldn't be interpreted as hostile. It's just, it's just some cultural differences,
yeah.
And in our communities, the Muslim communities, they shouldn't let the takfiris and so forth to exploit this. I
was just saying, I agree. The bigger problem, macro problems are hard. The smaller problems, I think there are capacity issues and resource issues within communities. They are trying where they can, but they lack that confidence and that self-belief. And they need champions from within. They need role models. They need a sense of being able to kind of get ahead where there seems to be more problems than solutions. And in the absence of all of that, it's difficult to kind of come out and come forward and start to make things happen. And I think some resources have come into kind of integration initiatives and coexistence dialogue kind of things. And these were happening much more. But again, if any of these projects do happen, and we always need these kinds of projects, they tend to be framed under countering extremism, which doesn't help at all. But that's the way that the funding formulas tend to often work. But what we're seeing here, and I agree that we need some capacity building and some resources and some support to communities and say, look, it's okay. It can be done, and there are many solutions. Let's try and learn from each other and share those practices. And over time, we see it does work out. It's just right now we're in a very sort of problematic dip in the curve. Pre 9/11, there were Muslims in Sweden, not many. Migration has been trickling in from 60s and 70s. Denmark and other Nordic countries. Certainly Denmark has a longer history of the guest worker system. But the refugees and asylum seekers has been much more of what Sweden, Norway has seen, particularly, everything from the Somalis. We had Somalis arriving in Britain who'd come through Norway and become quite Europeanized. And although they didn't always enjoy that experience, they ended up in Europe, but in Britain, able to mobilize what they've learned and become quite effective in terms of setting up businesses and organizing themselves, to the much surprise to the Kashmiris who'd been there like 40, 50 years. I think all the Somalis are coming, taking our jobs and taking our communities, which is internalization of racism of another kind. So yeah, lots of work to do, but support would be good. And positive framing would also be good. And the political will, hopefully this far-right government will not come into power in Sweden, hopefully, and anything with a bit more balance to it might help, certainly much more. Yeah, lots of challenging issues ahead for sure.
A note of hope, if not optimism, to finish on. Thank you both so much. It was great to have you. We hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best. Thanks, Gabriel. Thanks. Bye for now.